I don't know if that cobbled corner on Rue St. Denis still exists. The one where my heel used to click especially sharp, like it remembered, this is where I belong. Maybe it's a bakery now. Maybe it all burned down long ago. But if you walk there at night and you listen carefully, maybe, just maybe, you'll hear someone whisper in the dark, "One more stitch, one more nail." My name was Guillaume. I was a cobbler, and I want to tell you what it was like to live in a city that stitched not just shoes, but lives. And for now, if you're still awake, leave a comment and tell me what minute you drifted off and where you're listening from. Subscribe. Tomorrow, I'll tell you something else the world forgot. The first sound is always the same. It isn't the bells of St. Jacques, though they will follow soon enough. It isn't the clatter of carts or the shouting of bakers flinging open their shutters. It's this, the slow pull of a knife through stiff leather. My hand makes it before I am even fully awake. That tug, that dry rasp like someone sighing into cloth. It is the sound of a day's beginning here in my shop on Rue St. Denis. The light outside is still pale, filtered through the narrow alleys like wine through muslin. But in here, the world is already warm. It smells of resin, of tallow, of a damp memory of wood shavings. The coals in my brazier are half asleep, but alive. I sit cross-legged on my workbench, apron folded, knife in hand. Around me, the silence of leather saws waiting to become something more. Paris in 1480 is many things. It is dirty, crowded, loud, but at this hour before the drunkards rouse, before the merchants scream prices, it is soft, human. You can hear footsteps, not the wild, rushing kind. Just quiet shoes tapping cobblestones. Lovers, maybe. A washerwoman late. A baker's boy with his first delivery. Sometimes I like to imagine them walking in shoes I made. That's pride, yes, but also hope, because shoes outlast people. I've seen it. Shoes found on a body in the Seine. Shoes returned by a priest whose parishioner didn't wake up. Shoes brought in by widows who can't bear to throw them away. If I make them well, they live longer than we do. And if I make them poorly well, they scream. Feet are not quiet when mistreated, so I begin slowly. First, I check yesterday's pair. It's for a merchant's apprentice ambitious, but too thin in the ankle. He walks like he's still trying to grow into himself. I shape the sole just slightly inward. It will help. He won't notice. That's the point. A good cobbler hides the fix. A great one lets the foot forget it ever limped. Outside, the first cart rumbles past. Turnips, I think. Then the cry of a girl selling onions. Her voice cracks. She's young, new to the job. The city has not yet thickened her lungs. I stretch my arms, roll my neck. My hands are already black at the nails. Resin never leaves you, nor does tallow, nor, if I'm honest, the stink of other people's feet. But you stop noticing. What stays with you are the patterns, the shape of wear, the left heel that always goes first, the toes that curl in pain. You begin to read lives in these things. Yesterday, a nobleman's servant brought in a pair of velvet slippers, torn at the seam, red silk lining, barely touched. I asked how they'd ripped. He wouldn't say. Just looked away and asked for them back by Sunday. The left one had blood in the stitching. I didn't ask whose. Not all shoes tell gentle stories, but most do. There's an old widow who comes every second Tuesday. She's walked the same route for 20 years. I know because her soles wear in a perfect oval never a stray step. She brings gingerbread sometimes. Says I remind her of her son. I don't have the heart to say I'm older than he ever lived to be. The shop is awake now. Light hits the little window above the door. Dust dances. My tools gleam like they've been waiting for me. Awl, needle, last, hammer. Simple things. Honest things. Things that make other things. Before I begin work proper, I do one more thing. I whisper. Not a prayer. Not really. Just a habit I started long ago when I was apprenticed and scared and everything hurt. I whisper to the shoes. May you walk far. May you walk safe. May you never return in pain. Then I set the first sole on the last, press my thumb to the seam, and breathe. Another day begins. They start arriving before the sun is fully over the rooftops. Some knock, some just push the door open and glance around like they've stumbled into a memory. I've come to know most of them, not by name, but by gait. There's the man who limps but never speaks of it. A left foot drag with a soft heel slap. There's a shuffle in his step that tells you he once walked in armor. He brings me boots worn to the tendon. I fix them, and he nods once before vanishing. I don't know where he goes, but every week he returns. Then comes the seamstress, always in a rush, always pinching a spool of thread between her fingers. Her shoes wear thin at the ball of the foot. She stands too much. She once asked me if I had something softer. I offered her goat leather. She cried when she put it on. Said it was like walking on clouds. Clouds in Paris. We both laughed at that. Children come too. Loud, barefoot, sticky-fingered. I don't charge them. I keep a bin of half-repaired clogs and mismatched laces. And they dig through it like it's treasure. One girl, perhaps 7, brought me a single shoe she found in the gutter. Said it looked lonely. I cleaned it, mended the strap, and gave it to her. She carried it like a relic. The wealthier clients arrive closer to midday. They come with servants, with demands, with impatience wrapped in velvet. They want fine things, soft calfskin, dyed soles, delicate stitching. They do not care how long it takes, only that it is perfect. One woman wanted her heels to sing when she walked. I asked if she meant to squeak or to tap. She said, no, to sing, like the bells of Notre Dame. I did my best. She was disappointed. And yet, even in their entitlement, there's vulnerability. A nobleman once brought me shoes too small for his feet. He said nothing, but I saw the bruises. I made him a new pair no charge. He never returned. But his steward began bringing his own shoes soon after. Sometimes I see people more than I should. I watch them walk away and wonder where they go. There's a man with muddy boots who always smells of fish. A woman with cracked sandals and ink on her fingertips. A boy with bandaged toes who limps, but smiles. They tell me things, in passing. About sick mothers, about rent overdue, about a lover who left, or one who returned after too long. I nod. I listen. I don't give advice. I mend. I once repaired the boots of a midwife. She said, these soles have felt the pain of 100 births. I added a second layer of leather. She came back months later and kissed my cheek. In this shop, there's no curtain between work and story. Every thread pulls on a memory. Every soul carries a secret. A priest visits once a month. He never brings shoes. He just sits and watches me work. Says the rhythm reminds him of his prayers. I offered him wine once, he said. Not until I sin. We've been friends ever since. A butcher's apprentice once brought in boots caked in something thick and red. He said it was blood from a cow. I didn't ask. I soaked them in vinegar, stitched them clean. He tipped me a sausage. It was terrible. One woman brought in a pair of men's shoes. She said they belonged to her husband, now gone. I nodded, but she stopped me. He's not dead, just not coming back. I fixed them anyway. She cried. And sometimes no one comes. Those are the quiet days. The ones when the air feels too still, like it's waiting. I oil my tools. I sharpen my knife. I clean the floor with water and thyme. I sit by the window and sew for no one. But even then, the city moves. I hear it in the footsteps outside. The rhythm of wood carts, the distant hum of prayer, the clink of coins, the slap of worn soles on uneven stone. Paris is a city of motion, and my little shop is a place where that motion stops, just long enough to be mended. By the time evening comes, the light is amber, faces blur in shadow, customers become silhouettes. I work by candle now, and every stitch glows. There is an old man almost blind who comes only after sunset. He says the world feels kinder in the dark. He brings me slippers so thin, I wonder how he hasn't fallen. I don't repair them. I make new ones and stain them to look worn. He says I'm the only liar he trusts. Sometimes, before I sleep, I sit by the fire and sort through scraps of leather. I touch each one, soft, stiff, suede, smooth. I remember who they belong to, the widow, the priest, the little girl with the gutter shoe. I whisper thanks, because I don't just make shoes. I keep people walking, and in this city, that's no small kindness. If I ever go blind, I will still know my work, by touch, by smell, especially the smell. Good leather smells like earth and effort, like the back of a cow in summer, like sweat, tallow, and something faintly sweet, like wet bark left in the sun. Bad leather? You know it before your hands even reach it. It smells sharp, almost sour, like a promise broken in haste. I don't use bad leather, not because I'm proud, though perhaps I am, but because if I stitch something unworthy, it haunts me, like a squeak in a quiet room. You think you can ignore it, until it's all you hear. I remember once, years ago, I bought a whole hide from a man in Montmartre. It looked fine at first, thick, pliable, dark as old wine. But by the second cut, my knife caught on something. The grain was wrong, the pores too wide, cheap stuff. Treated poorly, maybe even boiled. I didn't finish that pear. Burned the leather in my stove and sat there, watching it curl like a sleeping cat. It smelled like lies. Now I buy only from Jacques the tanner, down by the river. He stinks to heaven. The whole street does. But his hides are honest. He soaks them in lime, scrapes them clean, dries them on racks in the wind. When I get them, they're still soft, still breathing in a way. I hang them by the window in my shop. Not for show, no one looks up, but so the morning sun hits them. The light makes them glow, almost golden. Sometimes I talk to them. Who will you become? I ask. Where will you walk? Now the nails are gold. Not literally, of course, but in value. A small bag of them costs more than a day's bread. Each one must be sharp, clean, and true. Bent nails are a curse. They split the soul. Wound the leather. Waste time. I keep mine in a small tin box under a false plank in the workbench. Not because of thieves, though they exist, but because of children. They think nails are toys. They build cathedrals in the mud, bury them like treasure, tap them into wooden stumps. And I can't afford that. You might think it's just a nail. But here, in 1480 Paris, everything costs something. A meal, a favor, a secret, a nail. I've mended a shoe with only 3 nails when I needed 6. I've bartered a dozen for a loaf of bread during winter. I once pulled an old nail from a broken bench just to finish a pair before Mass. Nails hold more than leather together. They hold the weak, the rent, the peace. When I drive one through the sole, there's a sound, a sharp, clean tap. It means done, secure, held. There is comfort in that. The fire had nearly gone out by the time I came in. The wind outside had picked up again, and the door, swollen from yesterday's rain, scraped the floor loud enough to wake the cat, who shot me a look like I'd just insulted her lineage. I kicked off my boots and left them by the hearth. They were soaked through and would need drying, but that could wait until tomorrow. Isabel was already there, sitting on her stool, shawl around her shoulders, spoon in hand, stirring whatever it was she'd been brewing since midday. I could smell leeks, barley, maybe the last of the pork from the market last week, if there was meat left in that bone at all. She didn't turn when I came in, didn't need to. She just said, "Don't track mud across the floor." I just swept. I looked behind me. I hadn't tracked anything. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. I hung my cloak on the peg near the door, the one that wobbles when you breathe on it too hard, and sat down near the fire. The warmth wasn't much, but it was enough to make the ache in my knees feel like something I could live with. Matthew and Margot were on the floor, playing some quiet game that involved tapping sticks together and laughing when the sticks broke. I didn't ask the rules. I knew better. The room smelled like it always did in the evenings. Damp wool, iron pots, smoke, and something sweet under it all. A smell I never named. The smell of being tired and alive, I suppose. Isabel handed me a bowl without looking. Careful. It's hot. I took it, grateful even before I tasted it. The broth was thin, but warm. The barley soft, the leeks still holding their shape. The pork, there was barely any, but it had given the whole thing flavor, and that was enough. We didn't speak much while we ate. Just the occasional sound of spoons tapping bowls, or Margot asking for more. Matthew pretended he wasn't hungry, like boys do when they're trying to look strong. But he finished his second helping before I finished my first. The wind howled once outside, and the shutter in the loft banged open. Isabel didn't flinch. "Still haven't fixed that," she said. I nodded. "Tomorrow," I promised, like I had the day before. After supper, the children huddled by the hearth, pretending to be asleep so they wouldn't be sent to bed just yet. Margot had curled herself against the cat, who pretended not to like it, but never moved away. Matthew lay with his hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling like he expected it to speak. Isabel washed the bowls with cold water, her hands red and chapped. When she was done, she sat beside me. Not too close. We were never ones for unnecessary fuss, but close enough that I could feel the edge of her shawl brush my arm. She picked up her spindle and began twisting thread like she did every night. The rhythm of it was soft, steady, almost like breathing. "You stitched that boy's boots today?" she asked, eyes on the spindle. "The butcher's nephew," I replied. "He walks heavy." I added double saws. She nodded once. "He's got legs like turnips. Always running." There was a pause. Then quieter. "You remembered to charge him?" I smiled. "Of course. Not in eggs this time?" "A coin. An actual coin." That earned me a glance. Not quite proud, not quite teasing. Just ... Isabel. I leaned back against the wall, and for a moment we were both quiet again. The fire had died down to its last few embers, just enough light to cast long shadows behind the children. Matthew had finally nodded off. Margot wasn't far behind. Isabel reached for the small tin by the hearth, the one where she kept the salve, and without a word, took my hand. She didn't ask. She just looked at the cracks, the calluses, the raw places along my knuckles, and began rubbing the mixture into them, slow and gentle. It stung. It always did. But I didn't pull away. "You'll wear your hands to the bone before spring," she murmured. I shrugged. "Better my hands than my boots." She didn't laugh, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch. After a while, she began to hum. Same tune as always, no words. Just a low melody her grandmother taught her. Or maybe she made it up. Either way, it filled the room the way the fire used to. Quietly, slowly, just enough to hold back the cold. And for that small moment, that single fleeting stretch of time between supper and sleep, the house didn't feel poor. It didn't feel cold, or broken, or tired. It felt like something whole. And I thought, not for the first time, that if all I ever did in life was sit in that room with those people, listening to that tune while the wind clawed at the shutters outside, then maybe I hadn't wasted anything at all. Winters aren't kind to us cobblers. The cold creeps in through the doorframe, curls under your collar, and settles in your joints like it's paying rent. You can hammer nails with numb fingers. I've done it many times, but you'll curse each one, and they'll curse you back by bending where they shouldn't, or splitting leather like it's parchment. There's no real warmth in our house. Not the kind rich folks talk about. No roaring fire, no fine wool draped over the chairs, no mulled wine steaming in pewter cups. What we have is a small hearth, a pile of damp wood, and blankets patched with so many old garments, I've forgotten what they used to be. My mother's apron, Isabel's old shawl, a piece of curtain from the tenant's room above the tannery that we found on the street last spring, each one stitched by her hand, each one a quiet story we never wrote down. We sleep close in winter, sometimes all four of us in the same bed, sometimes Margot curled beside the cat, who only tolerates it when she's dreaming. Matthew, now too proud to share the bed, lies on a straw mattress near the door and insists he is not cold, though I've seen him sneak my cloak over himself when he thinks we re-sleeping. I pretend not to notice. That's how fathers love sons sometimes, by pretending. There's a trick we use to keep the warmth in. Isabel places a brick in the fire before bed, wrapped in rags. We tuck it at our feet under the blanket, and for a few hours, it fools us into thinking we live softer lives. By morning, it's cold, of course, but we wake with the memory of warmth still in our skin, and sometimes that's enough. And then there are the winters, when the bread is thinner, the lard runs out, and your breath hangs in the air inside your own home like a ghost that forgot to leave. Those days, I don't bother lighting the fire in the shop. I bring my work inside, sit by the hearth, and stitch by the window until the frost climbs too high, and I have to melt the ice off the pane just to see the street. I patch more in winter than I make. People can't afford new boots when the firewood eats their coin. So they bring me what they have: cracked soles, split seams, laces chewed by rats. One man paid me with a bag of chestnuts. Another offered prayers. I took both. The chestnuts fed us. The prayers, well, they didn't hurt. But summer is different. When the heat finally arrives in Paris, it doesn't knock politely. It barges in, thick and sudden, coating the streets in sweat and stink. The air turns still. The Seine grows sour, and people walk slower, as if trying not to wake something sleeping in the stones. The shop is unbearable by midday. The leather sweats. My tools burn to the touch, so I work in the alley behind the house, under the patchy shade of a crooked beam and two crookeder clotheslines. Flies buzz, children scream, and the world smells like fish, tar, and flowers trying their best. This is when the new orders come. Not boots, but sandals. Not patching, but crafting. Fine work, delicate straps, tiny buckles for women who want to be seen. Isabel helps sometimes. She has a gentler hand for threading, and I trust her with the thin leathers, the ones I'm too clumsy with when the heat makes my fingers swell. The children run barefoot all summer. No sense in shoes when the stones are warm, and the river calls them like an old friend. Margot comes home every other day with a splinter or a scrape. Matthew builds traps for frogs and forgets he's meant to help me with deliveries. I let it slide. There's a softness to summer, even in the hunger. On good days, we sell enough to buy fruit, not the shriveled ones from the cart. Real fruit, plums that stain your fingers, pears so ripe they almost fall apart before you bite. I once brought home a whole melon. Isabel laughed like I'd brought her a necklace. We ate it on the floor, with spoons, while the cat glared from the windowsill. Summer stitching is lighter, quicker, more forgiving. You can see without a lamp. The thread runs smoother. The awl doesn't need warming between your palms. There's music in the street, fiddles, voices, someone singing too high on wine. But winter ... Winter remembers. It holds your fingers hostage. It reminds you of every crack in your wall, every hole in your roof, every debt you swore you'd repay in the spring. And yet, strangely, I think I love the winters more. Maybe because we're closer. Maybe because you notice the warmth more when you have to build it together. The way Isabel pulls the blanket higher when she thinks I'm asleep. The way Margot tucks her cold feet under mine without asking. The way Matthew mumbles his prayers out loud. Just loud enough for the rest of us to pretend we're not listening. In summer, we live wide, windows open, doors ajar, voices carrying into the street. But in winter, we fold into each other like stitched leather. Tight, quiet, made to last. Children ask questions the way rain falls, sudden, endless, and rarely at the right time. You'll be elbow deep in glue, or halfway through stitching a difficult arch, and suddenly hear, "Papa, do animals go to confession?" And you have to stop, not because you have an answer, but because it would be rude not to. Margot is the worst or the best, depending on the hour. She asks questions like someone who suspects the world is lying to her. She asked me once if the moon was just God's lantern, and if so, who carries it during the day? Another time, she asked if shoes ever get tired of being walked on. And I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, "Only if you drag your feet." She gave me a look far too old for someone with jam on her chin, and said, "I think they just pretend to be fine." I set my tools down after that. Just for a moment, Matthew's questions are heavier. He's 11 now, and he is in that limbo between child and not quite man, the place where knees grow faster than wisdom and voices try to deepen too soon. He asks about taxes, about death, about why men shout when they drink too much, and why the priest looked so sad last Sunday, even though he just told us to rejoice. He asked me last week if I was ever afraid. We were walking back from the tanner's yard, my bag of leather over one shoulder, and the sun just starting to fall behind the spires. "Afraid of what?" I asked. He shrugged, as boys do when they mean everything. "Just afraid." I didn't answer right away. I wanted to, but he looked up at me like my answer might change the shape of the sky, and I didn't want to lie to him, not about that. So I said, "Every day, Matthew. But most days, I don't let it stop me." He nodded once and didn't ask anything else until we got home. But he stood a little closer to me than usual, and I let him. At night, their questions come softer. Margot, curled like a comma under her blanket, always has one more thought, one more idea. Last week she asked me if saints ever sleep. The week before it was, "Papa, what's the first thing you remember?" That one caught me. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wasn't sure if it was true. I told her the smell of my mother's soap, rosemary and lye. And she said, "I think I'll remember your boots." I don't know what she meant exactly. Maybe the smell, maybe the sound, maybe the way they're always by the door, as if I'm about to leave even when I've just arrived. Sometimes I wonder what questions they'll carry with them when they're grown. Will they remember how Isabel always touches their foreheads before bed, tracing some invisible blessing? Will they remember the stew she makes with more salt than we can afford, because she swears it tastes like her father's? Will they remember me bent over a shoe, muttering curses in the language of cracked saws and bent nails? I hope so. I hope they'll remember more than the cold days and empty cupboards. Because we've had laughter, too. We've had afternoons when Margot turned the alley into a kingdom, and Matthew defended it with a broken broom and a milk crate helmet. We've had nights when we all lay by the fire, bellies full for once, and Isabel sang an old song about a sailor who married the sea. We laughed when she forgot the words and made new ones. And the cat left the windowsill just to sit beside her, which meant it was a good night. Children make the world askable. They poke holes in things you thought were sealed. And somehow, they love you not because you have answers, but because you're willing to try. Matthew still asks how I make a boot last longer. I show him the stitching, the angles, the tricks. But he's not really asking about boots. He's asking about life, about holding things together when they want to come apart. And I suppose in that way, I'm still learning the answer myself. There's a rhythm to life here, one not kept by clocks or bells, but by the distance between two markets, two tax days, two fairs. If you asked me what month it is, I'd have to think. But if you asked how long until the next fair in St. Denis, I could tell you down to the day. That's how we measure time, not in numbers, but in waiting. Everything we do, everything we buy or mend or give up on, revolves around those anchor points. The big fair in spring, the smaller one in harvest, and the winter market, if we then manage to save enough to get there without freezing to death or starving on the road. Those are the pulses in a cobbler's year. Moments when the world opens a little wider, and we remember that life isn't just mending what's broken, but sometimes, if we're lucky, trading up. Between fairs, life is a long stretch of trying not to fall behind. Take the price of leather. It rises in winter like bread dough left too close to the hearth. By February, even scraps cost more than a pair of new shoes would in June. I ration what I have. I stitch tighter. I save the heel pieces from worn-out boots and repurpose them for children's sandals. Every cut must be clean, every seam exact, because one mistake can't be hidden and can't be afforded. We don't waste. Not cloth, not broth, not candle ends. I once made a pair of slippers out of an old saddle someone left for dead. They creaked like morning bells, but they kept the feet dry. The priest says there is dignity in honest work, and I believe him most days. But dignity doesn't pay the woodman, or buy soap, or stop the landlord from knocking with his palm out and his smile thin. So we budget in whispers. Isabel tracks every coin, every crust. She knows the price of salt to the ounce, the cost of lamp oil to the last drop, the exact number of days a cabbage will last before it turns. She knows how to haggle without speaking, how to trade half a loaf for 3 onions and make it feel like a blessing. The children think fairs are magic, and in a way they are. On fair days, the city changes color. The streets swell with sound. Sellers with voices like drum beats chant prices no one believes. Musicians stomp through mud puddles, fiddles screaming joy. Strangers smell of spices. Horses clatter past with bells. And someone's always shouting, "Thief!" even if no one's stolen a thing. Margot runs ahead, chasing chickens. Matthew clutches his coin pouch like it might fly away. And I walk with my bag of boots slung over my shoulder, hoping to trade 3 pairs for enough cloth to make Isabel a new apron and maybe, just maybe, buy a bit of ribbon for Margot's hair. I set up my stall on the edge of the market, not where the nobles go, not where the guild boys strut with their polished signs, but near the soup carts and knife grinders, where the smells are thick and the prices are flexible. Hand-stitched. Solid solace. Paris work. I call. Some stop, most don't, but I sell. Not much, but enough. Pair for the miller's wife. Another for a traveling priest who walks like his faith is heavy. Sometimes someone offers a trade. Eggs, flour, a length of wool, even stories. I once gave a pair of boots to a boy who sang me a tune so sad it made Isabel cry when I hummed it later. But the fair ends. It always ends. And as the carts rattle away and the music fades behind the hills, the math begins again. What did we gain? What did we lose? One year we came home with a chicken that refused to lay eggs. Another year, a dented pot and a sprained ankle. Another, a new coat for Matthew. Too big, but he wore it like a knight wears armor. And yet, always, we come back lighter in coin, but heavier in hope. Not the loud kind, not joy, just the quiet hope that we'll make it to the next fair, that the boots will hold, that the soup will stretch, that the walls won't leak too badly this winter, that the cat will stay. We don't ask for more than that, just the next fair. Because between one and the next is where most of life happens. The slow burn of soup, the whisper of thread, the laughter of children, the ache in your back that tells you you've earned rest. It's not grand, it's not glory, but it is ours. It began with the bells, not the usual ones, not the steady call of morning mass, or the market chimes that signaled the gates had opened, not even the warning clang that rang out when some thief made trouble in the Rue des Lombards. No, this bell rang slow, heavy, like it was being dragged from the depths of the earth itself. It was Saint Jacques. And when that bell tolls, not once, but 3 times before the sun's even cleared the rooftops, it means someone important has died, or something worse has arrived. The sound rolled down the street like thunder wrapped in iron. I remember standing at my workbench, thread in my teeth, half a boot still resting under my palm, when it rang a second time. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Isabel stepped into the shop. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me. And then the third toll. That was the morning we heard the name for the first time. Plague. Not whispered behind hands. Not muttered in the corners of the wine shop. No, this time it was said out loud, by the city crier, by the priest, by the mayor himself. It had reached the river quarter. A child, then 2 more. By week's end, it was 7 dead, and the bell was ringing every morning. I remember the way the streets changed, like the city held its breath and waited for a verdict. People stopped touching bread before buying it, stopped shaking hands in the market. Doors stayed shut longer. Some were marked. You'd walk down a lane you knew, a place you'd passed 100 times, and see the sign. A crude X chalked on the door. Sometimes a twig tied to the handle. Sometimes just silence. No smoke from the chimney, no laughter, no dogs barking. Nothing. I passed by the apothecary one morning and saw a bundle wrapped in linen at the corner of his shop. No name, no ceremony. Just a body, waiting. By the end of the 2nd week, the bell had no pattern. It rang at dawn, at noon, sometimes twice before dark. We stopped counting. Isabel began boiling everything, water, cloth, even the children's wooden toys. She scrubbed the table with vinegar until the wood went pale and soft. She laid sprigs of lavender in the corners of the room, and when that ran out, we used mint, then onion peels, then nothing. We kept Margot inside, told her the streets were too wet, too dirty, too loud. She didn't understand. Not until the neighbor's child, the one with the lisp who always tried to race her with a stick, stopped coming to play. And then Margot stopped asking. Matthew tried to be brave. He helped me board up the gaps under the eaves, stuffed old rags around the window frames. But he flinched every time the bell rang. One evening he asked, "Is it God doing this?" I didn't know what to say, so I said what my father said to me once. If it is, then maybe we deserve better. That didn't help, but he nodded. The worst part wasn't the sickness, not yet. It was the waiting, the watching, the knowledge that it was coming, but you didn't know from where or when or through which door it would enter. Some people left the city. Some, richer than sense, paid their way into the countryside. Others locked themselves in and never came out again. We couldn't afford either. So we stayed, worked, washed, waited. I kept my hands busy. It's what I know to do. Boots still needed mending. Feet didn't stop walking just because the sky turned sour. But I watched my customers more closely, looked at their faces, checked their hands. If someone coughed, I didn't take the shoes in. I said I was full, said to come back next week. Some didn't. The bell tolled again and again, until it felt like a part of the city's breath, until silence itself became suspicious, until you realized the real horror wasn't tea when the bell rang. It was when it suddenly didn't. The first time I saw one, it was at the baker's. A sack, canvas, tied with rough twine, shaped like a man, but folded wrong. It had been left by the door, not inside, not in the street, just there, leaning like it had fallen asleep standing. There was no note, there never is. Only a soft dark stain where the fabric touched the stone. The baker himself stood inside the shop, hands still dusted in flour, staring at the wall behind the counter like he was counting something that didn't want to be counted. When I entered, he didn't speak, didn't even flinch. He just gestured toward the day-old loaves and said, 3 for 1. That was all. I bought them, even though we had some at home, even though I wasn't hungry, even though it felt like buying bread from a grave. That was the beginning of the sacks. After that, they began appearing all over the quarter, outside doors, in alleys, at the corner near the tannery. Some wrapped tight, some loose, some so small it twisted something in your chest to look too long. They never stayed long. There were men, not official, not in uniform, not paid, I don't think, who came with carts. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They'd pick up the sack, sometimes 2 at once, and stack them like firewood, then cover the load with a canvas that fluttered as they moved down the road. I saw one of those carts tip on Rue St. Martin. It hit a stone, bounced once, and one of the sacks rolled off, tore open at the seam. I didn't look inside, but I heard a woman scream and drop her bucket. After that, people started keeping their doors closed, even when it was too hot inside, even when the air turned thick and soured from vinegar and sweat. Better to bake than to risk what might blow in with the wind. Even the taverns went quiet. At first, they stayed open. Men still drank, more maybe, pretending that the ale would disinfect the fear clinging to their throats. But then a few tavern keepers fell ill, and then their wives, and then a whole tavern was boarded up one morning, without a word, with still full tankards sitting on tables behind the windows, like ghosts waiting for their drinkers to return. The laughter stopped. The dice stopped rolling. The chairs stayed empty. I passed one tavern I used to deliver boots to, the Singing Pig. Its shutters were nailed shut. A sign had fallen sideways and now hung like a broken neck. Someone had chalked something on the door. I don't know what it said. I didn't want to know. Back in our house, we spoke in low voices. Not because we were afraid of being overheard, but because everything else was quiet. And to speak too loudly felt like a challenge to something ancient, something listening. Even the cat stopped yowling. She just watched. Sat by the window, tail flicking, gaze following nothing. Cats know, I think. They always know. Isabel stopped going out. She said it wasn't worth the risk. Not for eggs, not for salt. We made do. We boiled water for drinking, steeped herbs in vinegar, burned rosemary by the door. She stitched little pouches of dried flowers, rue, lavender, sage, and hung them over the windows. Not because she believed they'd work, but because it gave her something to do with her hands. And sometimes that's enough. Margot started drawing things on the walls in charcoal. She said they were saints. One had a halo, and 2 had swords. I didn't stop her. Better that than questions she didn't want the answers to. Matthew became quiet. Too quiet for a boy his age. He helped without being asked, sat with Isabel while she mended, listened when I read aloud from the old prayer book. But there was something in his eyes. the kind of knowing no child should carry. He asked me once if I'd seen anyone die. I lied, said no, said I only saw the sacks. He nodded, didn't ask again. That night, we heard the bell toll 6 times, and then, an hour later, 7, then 8. By then, the sound no longer startled. It settled into your chest like a second heartbeat. A reminder, a countdown. Still, the city moved. People still fetched water, still swept doorsteps, still stitched shoes and ground flour and fed chickens. Because life doesn't stop when death arrives. It just gets quieter. The priest came to our street on the 3rd Sunday of that dark month. I don't remember the exact date anymore, only that the sky was white with cloud and the air smelled of copper and whetstone. He came alone. No altar boys, no procession. Just a small wooden bucket in one hand and a brass cross in the other. So polished it caught what little light the day offered and threw it back like it meant to blind something unseen. We heard him before we saw him. A voice, hoarse from prayer or too much smoke, it was hard to say, reciting psalms in Latin, verse by verse, like a song you remember but don't fully understand. And as he passed each doorway, he flicked water in the shape of a cross, one for the living inside, one for the dead who might still be listening, and one, I suppose, for whatever lingered between. He paused in front of our house, didn't look in, didn't knock, just raised his hand, wet with the water that had long since gone cold, and let it drip once onto the lintel. Then he moved on. Isabel said nothing, only wiped the spot with the corner of her sleeve. Not because she was ungrateful, but because the priest had passed 7 other houses that morning, and 5 of them were marked by dusk. You don't to put faith in a flick of water when the air itself carries death like perfume. Still, we tried. People always do. The church handed out little slips of parchment with prayers printed on them. Printed, not written. As if God would listen more closely to words made by machine. Psalm 91, they told us. Say it over your threshold. Say it at night. Say it until you believe it. And so we did. We pinned them above doorways. We murmured them under our breath while stirring soup, while dressing children, while folding blankets stiff with lye soap and fear. But the sickness did not care. It came for the pious and the faithless alike, for the monk who knelt until his knees bled, and for the wine seller who hadn't set foot in a chapel since his wedding. The relics came next. People wore bits of saint's bone around their necks, pressed rosaries into the palms of the sick, placed small wax figures of Mary and Michael above cribs and beside beds. One man near the square swore by a clove of garlic worn under the tongue. Another placed a vial of holy oil beneath his floorboards. Someone started burning old shoes at the crossroads, said the smoke would drive away evil spirits. I didn't believe in any of it, but I did all of it. Because belief didn't matter, only the chance that something, anything, might help. We hung sprigs of rue by the door, lit candles even when we couldn't afford the wax, rubbed our wrists with vinegar and rose water, held our breath when we passed others in the street. The apothecaries sold out of everything. Dried rosemary, powdered sulfur, even the moldy green loaves of bread people believed might prevent contagion if placed under the bed. Matthew began sleeping with a crucifix beneath his pillow. Margot took to whispering to Saint Genevieve, not praying, whispering, like she was telling secrets to a friend who might intervene if the mood struck her. Isabel stitched a small pouch of dried herbs and pinned it to the inside of my coat. "Don't take it off," she said. "I won't," I lied. But I did, once, when the smell made me dizzy while working. That afternoon, the boy next door fell ill. I wore it every day after that. The priests started carrying incense in the street, swinging it from iron chains, muttering blessings while the smoke rose in thick coils that clung to your clothes and turned your throat raw. One evening, we stood at the window, and watched a procession pass. 20 people, walking slow, faces covered, each carrying a candle, or a relic or a scrap of holy cloth. In the center, a statue of the Virgin swayed on a wooden litter, hoisted by 4 trembling shoulders. No one spoke. Even the children stayed silent, eyes wide and unblinking, hands held too tightly in their mother's palms. The flame of the last candle flickered out before they reached the end of the street. They didn't stop, just kept walking into the dark. That's the thing about holy water. It gives you something to do with your hands. It lets you feel like you're not helpless. But it does not stop the fever. It does not slow the breathing. It does not cool the burning skin or pull the black marks from under the arms. It does not save, but we keep blessing. Because without blessing, there is only waiting. And waiting without hope is a kind of death all its own. It was late afternoon when the knock came. Not the kind you expect. Not a customer's knock. Not the sharp rap of a messenger. Not the hesitant tap of a child asking if I have anything from the bin. It was slow, deliberate. 2 knocks. A pause, then one more. Like someone following a rhythm only they could hear. I opened the door, expecting to find no one. And for a moment, I didn't. Just the wind and a figure across the street, hooded, waiting. He didn't speak right away. Just stared at the boots hanging in the window. Then, quietly, "Do you make them for the dead?" I almost laughed. Almost. But something in his voice stopped me. I told him, "I make them for the living. But sometimes, the living don't get to wear them." He nodded once, slowly, and came closer. He wasn't dressed like a priest, not like a mourner either. Just plain wool, dark, weather-beaten, and stiff from long days without fire. He reached into his coat and pulled out a coin. A real one, not chipped, not stained. 2 pairs, he said. Adult, for travel, sturdy. I hesitated. Even now, even in that season, something in me resisted the strangeness of it. No measurements, no questions, no names. "Do they walk far?" I asked. He looked at me then, really looked, and something in his eyes told me all I needed to know. "No," he said, "but let them leave well dressed." I nodded and took the coin. I didn't ask anything else. That night, I sat in the dim yellow of my workshop, candles flickering low, and cut the leather with more care than I usually spared. Not because I feared judgment, but because something about the quiet in the room felt sacred, like a chapel without hymns. I stitched slowly, threaded every seam with precision, smoothed every edge with wax, made the saws thick, the kind that last long, even if the road beneath them doesn't. They were plain boots. No brass, no design, but strong, honest. I imagined the feet that would wear them, still, cold, dressed by someone else's hands. Perhaps someone who remembered what size they wore. Perhaps not. I thought about my father, how he died in spring, how I never knew what they buried him in, how I hoped, foolishly, it was something he would have approved of. By the time I finished, it was nearly morning. I wrapped the boots in linen, not new, but clean, tied the bundle with cord. The man came at dawn. He didn't knock this time, just stood by the door. I handed him the parcel. He didn't open it, didn't check the stitching, just placed one hand on it like he was blessing it. "Thank you," he said. Not many would have done it. I didn't say anything, just watched as he turned, boots in hand, and walked back into a city that no longer looked like mine. That day, I didn't take any new work, didn't light the fire in the shop, didn't speak much. Isabel noticed, of course. She didn't ask. She just placed her hand on mine that evening during supper and squeezed once, like she was holding me down gently to keep me from floating away. I've made hundreds of boots in my life, for merchants, for children, for drunkards, for priests. But I remember those 2 pairs. I remember the curve of the heel, the grain of the leather, the stillness in the room. Some say the dead don't care what they wear, but I think dignity matters, even at the end, especially at the end. It started with bread. It always does, doesn't it? Not fire, not blood, not banners or speeches, just bread, or rather, the lack of it. One morning, I went to the market before dawn, the way I used to, before the sickness, before the sacks, before everything in the city felt like a held breath. I needed onions, maybe some salt, if we could spare the coin. Isabel had given me a short list, 3 items. One look that meant, don't come back with anything foolish, and a kiss on the cheek that surprised us both. But the market was wrong. There was no shouting, no haggling, no calls of fresh eggs or good turnips, only quiet and eyes, too many eyes. The bread cart was there. It always arrived first, but it was empty. Just a pile of flour sacks, tied shut and clean. No loaves, not even crumbs. I asked the seller, an old man I'd known for years, who once traded a week's worth of rye for a pair of sandals I made his daughter. He didn't look up when he spoke. They came last night, he said. Took everything. Who? I asked. But he didn't answer, just wiped his hands on his apron and turned his back. That's when I noticed the guards. 2 of them, standing near the steps that led down to the river. Not the usual city watch, not the half-drunk, sleepy-eyed kind who mostly waved at people and kept an eye on pigs. No, these were armored, silent, clean, too clean. Across the market, someone said a word, tax. Then another voice said grain. And then someone else muttered something in a tone that doesn't survive daylight. By midday, the whispers were everywhere, that the guilds were hoarding, that the bishop's men had seized a warehouse. That flour was being carted by night to the nobles on the hill. No one knew the truth, but it didn't matter. In a hungry city, truth walks slower than rumor, and rumor had just broken into a run. That afternoon, the baker's wife slapped a man in the street. He accused her of hiding flour in the ceiling tiles. She screamed at him, called him a beggar and worse. He threw a stone. It missed, but it cracked her shop window. That was the first stone. The next day, I walked across the Petty Pont, the little bridge that spans the river near the bookbinder's quarter. The air was heavy, but not from rain. People had gathered, not shouting, not yet, just standing, watching the gates that led to the bishop's storehouse. Someone had daubed a mark on the stone. A red X, another hand, had written something beside it, poorly spelled, slashed with ink, but I didn't need to read it. The message was clear. They'd started to believe their hunger had a name. That night, Isabel told me not to go out the next morning. I said I had to. A woman from the Silk Street needed new walking shoes, and her husband paid in coin, real coin. Isabel didn't argue. She just handed me a small bundle. Inside, a cloth to cover my face, a crust of bread, and a note written in her uneven, careful hand. It said, if they start running, don't look back. Just come home. I carried it in my pocket. Didn't think I'd need it. Still don't know why I kept it, but I did. And the next day, the running began. The smell of bread disappeared before the bakers themselves did. That's how I knew things had changed. Not from proclamations or armed guards, not from the city crier, shouting news I already didn't trust, but from the absence of that daily perfume that rose with the sun and spilled through every window and alleyway. There is a silence in the city when there is no bread, and it hums through your stomach louder than any bell. On that morning, I walked past the old stone oven by St. Landry, where the widow Martel usually stood with her sons, pulling dark rye loaves from the fire with arms strong enough to lift me. But the door was shut, the window boarded, and on the wall, someone had scrawled in charcoal, nitrogen monoxide flour, nitrogen monoxide peace, Not poetry, not holy scripture, but honest. By mid-morning, 3 more ovens were closed. Not just paused, shut, shuttered, abandoned like the bakeries had fled overnight. And then the shouting began. At first, just angry voices in the grain quarter. A few women aprons stiff with ash, cheeks bright with rage, banging pots against barrels and demanding to see the weights. They swore the miller was lying, that the scales had been rigged, that the sacks were lighter, the loaves smaller, the prices higher. They were right, but being right doesn't always protect you. A boy threw a stone. Someone else overturned a cart. The guards arrived late. They always do, not to stop anything, but to arrive just in time to make it worse. I was in the alley behind my shop, cutting a length of rawhide, when I heard the first glass break. Then metal, the clang of pots or shields or something harder. Voices rose like a wave. Matthew came running, breathless. "There's a crowd," he gasped. At the Bishop's Square, hundreds. Isabel went pale. Not from fear, not exactly, but the kind of worry that knows exactly how bad things can get before anyone else does. She pulled him inside, told him to stay, told me quietly, "Don't go, please," but I had to see. I left through the back, heaping to the shadows, ducking through side alleys I hadn't walked in years. The city looked different. It felt tighter, like a pot left too low over the fire, everything inside bubbling just beneath the lid. When I reached the square, the crowd had already begun to shift from shouting to pushing. It's a small change, subtle, but you can feel it. The rhythm becomes erratic. Hands stop gesturing and start gripping. Someone threw a stool. Then someone else threw a bucket. Not at people, not yet, just into the air, as if testing gravity. The bishop's men had formed a line, shields up, eyes flat, too few of them to really stop anything, but standing anyway, like stone statues made of pride and poor training. Then a loaf of bread flew overhead. It struck one of them in the helmet with a dull thud. He flinched, and that was enough. The crowd surged forward. The line buckled. Someone screamed, not in pain, but in rage. And suddenly, it wasn't a protest. It was a storm. People grabbed sacks from stalls, tore shutters from shops. One man climbed onto a cart and shouted something about justice, but he was knocked down before the sentence ended. I ducked behind a pillar, watching as years of quiet hunger tore through stone and iron like parchment. No one was leading. No one had planned it. It was just too late to stop. When the bakers stopped baking, the city remembered that it knew how to starve. And when a city remembers its own hunger, it stops obeying. That night, smoke rose from the river quarter. Not a house, a granary. I could see it from the roof above my shop. Flames curled like fingers. No bells rang to stop it. I didn't sleep. Neither did Isabel. We sat in the dark with the shutters latched, listening to the distant shouting, the crash of barrels, the cracks of wood giving in. "Is it war?" Margot asked. "No," I said, then added, "Not yet." But we both knew that whatever it was, it had already started. By the next morning, the city felt different. Not broken, not yet, but unmoored. As if something had slipped out of place during the night, and no one quite knew how to put it back. The air was too still. Even the birds kept quiet. I stepped outside, and the first thing I noticed was the absence of smoke. Not the kind that chokes, but the kind that comforts. No hearths, no ovens, no morning meals. And then I heard it, a sound I hadn't heard since I was a boy, the sound of many footsteps, all moving in one direction. That's when I saw them. They came from every quarter, laborers with soot still on their faces, washerwomen with sleeves rolled, apprentices in patched cloaks, old men with canes held like scepters. No weapons, not really. A few sticks. A few tools turned sideways. A hammer, a scythe, the iron rod from a shopkeeper's door, and torches, of course. Always torches. They weren't marching. They weren't chanting. They were simply moving like water finally breaking through a dam. It wasn't rage, not exactly. It was something colder, more settled. Like they'd decided, we have waited, we have begged, we have prayed, and now we act. At first, I only watched, from the edge, from the alley behind my shop, where the walls are damp and the stones remember older riots. But when they passed me, this river of citizens in silence, I saw something that made my hands clench. Banut, my neighbor, a cooper. He was in the middle of the crowd, his shoulders straight, his wife's shawl tied around his face, and in his hand, the very mallet I had once helped him repair. He didn't look angry. He looked clear. I called out. He didn't hear me. Or maybe he did. I didn't call again. The crowd moved toward the Bishop S. storehouse, the same one that had survived the last riot untouched, because the gates were iron and the men guarding it were paid well and fast with their swords. But this time, the gates were open. I don't know who did it. Maybe someone inside? Maybe someone bought. Maybe someone who simply forgot to lock them. But open they were. And that was all it took. They didn't run. They walked in, pushed past the guards like they were reeds in a stream. They took sacks of flour, wheels of cheese, barrels of dried fish. No one stopped them. Not because they were afraid, though perhaps they were, but because how do you stop a crowd that no longer believes in the rules? I stood there for a long time, watching as people emerged from the gates, arms full, eyes wide. One boy dropped a loaf, and 5 others dove to catch it. A girl no older than Margot clutched a sack of oats like it was a newborn child. And then came the second wave, not for food, but for everything else. Someone knocked over a barrel. Someone else climbed onto a crate and shouted, "This is ours now." A cheer went up, not joyful, but sharp, jagged, like a snapped rope. The guards reappeared. Too late. They tried to form a line, but were swept aside like driftwood. One of them, I think his name was Roland, raised his sword. He didn't get the chance to use it. I didn't see who struck first, but I saw him fall. And that, as they say, was it. The crowd that had once begged, that had once pleaded for scraps outside locked gates, had become a force no man could reason with. By dusk, 2 storehouses were emptied. 1 was burned. A noble's coach was overturned in the square. 3 bakeries opened their doors, not to sell, but to give, and within the hour, they were bare. And in all of it, all the shouting, the breaking, the desperate scrambling, I never saw a single person laugh. This wasn't joy. This wasn't vengeance. This was hunger, finally answering back. I did not raise a torch. I did not break a door. I did not chant or spit or throw stones. I am a cobbler, a man who works with thread and silence. My hands are calloused not from war, but from years of shaping leather to fit the curve of lives I do not live. But I was there. I saw the smoke rise from the storehouses. I heard the bell of St. Jacques ring not for prayer, but for panic. I watched the guards flee down alleys they once patrolled with pride. I watched as children climbed into windows that once ignored them. I watched Paris change, not all at once, not forever, but enough to say, something broke here. And when it was over, when the food was gone, and the fires were smoldering, and the streets were slick with wine and ash, I went back to my bench, picked up the boot I'd been repairing before the noise began, threaded the needle, pulled it through. Outside, the city whispered its new rhythm. Some shops remained closed. Some never reopened. Some opened with new names, new prices, new rules written in smoke. The bishop fled to the countryside. The nobles doubled their guards. The priest stopped preaching about patience and began preaching about sin again. And the people, they kept walking, Because feet don't stop, not in grief, not in fire, not in revolution. Shoes still wear down, soles still crack, children still outgrow what they once ran in, and I still make boots. Sometimes for the living, sometimes not. Sometimes for someone who walks in one day with mud on their hem and a question in their eyes. Are you the cobbler? And I nod, because I am. Still, always. If you ever find yourself near Rue Saint-Antoine, near where the old fountain used to be, the one they tore down when the new road was built, you might pass a small wooden door, crooked and paint-flaked, with a single worn boot nailed to the beam above it. That was mine. That is mine. And if you press your hand to that door and listen very carefully, maybe you'll hear the whisper of a thread pulling tight, the hush of a city remembering, the steady breath of someone, somewhere, still stitching.